Hello, Dave Blakely. Thank you so much for joining me and having this conversation. It's great to see you from albeit a safe social distance.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's great to be here.
I want to do a quick introduction of you and your background for folks that don't know you, and we can fill in the details as we go. But I've known you for a number of years. You are someone who has just a great history and creativity in helping lead companies forward through all the disruption and change that we see in the world. You were with IDEO for, I think, about 17 years. You led a large group there, 35 plus people, a broad variety of talent, which IDEO is known for. But now you're with a company called Mach 49. You've got a really interesting background, just to touch on a few things. I mean, you've worked on stuff that's really high and you've worked on stuff that's really low. And a couple examples, you've helped astronauts that have walked on the moon on sort of next generation and improvements on their spacesuits. And in terms of looking down low, you've spent days in a submarine in a small cramped room with 8 other guys talking about and working on ways to improve their systems. And I know last summer, for example, you spent quite a bit of time in sub-Saharan Africa talking with merchants about credit. So you've done a lot of different things and you continue doing a lot of stuff. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tom.
So is there anything I missed that's worth mentioning that I overlooked in your background? I know there's a lot of stuff, but is there anything that I missed in particular?
Look, I just have to say for some of your listeners that might be early on in their career, the closer you get to early upfront customer research, the higher anecdote quotient you're likely to have in your job. In addition to the opportunities you mentioned, helping astronauts understand how to improve their spacesuits, working with sailors on submarines. I've marched around dairy farms with large animal veterinarians trying to come up with better tools for them. I could name, we could talk all day about some of the opportunities, and it's all to do with the fact that this new important trend, popularized originally by design thinking to get closer and more intimate with the customer, leads to just wonderful avenues in your day-to-day job.
And some great stories. You're also taught at the Stanford D.school, design school.
You bet.
So you've got so many things in your background. I'm really, really thrilled to be talking to you. Hey, I want to get right to a really important question. Why is it so difficult for companies to innovate moving forward?
Let me give you an answer that might surprise you, coming from a guy that spent his whole career helping large companies to create and build and launch new products and new services. It should be hard for big companies to innovate. It is hard, and it should be hard for them to innovate like startups. Look, I'm an investor. I'm an index fund investor. I have lots of investments in big blue chip companies, and I want 95% of those companies' resources to go into furthering things that they already do very, very well. So big companies are slow and deliberate for a reason, and that's governance. They've got a fiduciary of their responsibility to their shareholders to be very methodical and very careful with their new product and new service introductions, right? So what have you got? You've got a company which should put 90 to 95% of its resources on continuing to develop and offer its current proposition. And you've got massive momentum.
Right.
The critical piece I work with, Tom, and this is where things get hard, is that 5 to 10% of a Global 1000's resources that must be committed to new venture creation. And this is where you get into trouble, and this is where you run into the corporate antibodies, because it runs counter on so many levels to the culture of big companies.
I've never heard it phrased like that, corporate antibodies, but that phrase exactly summarizes what goes on in there. I mean, and the challenge, it's a built-in dichotomy. They've got to focus on moving this behemoth forward profitably. And there's so many things that they've got to navigate to do that. At the same time, they have to have all these different skills necessary to identify what's coming far out on the horizon which is
Yes.
beyond their quarter and probably beyond their, yearly numbers. And they've got to nurture these nascent possibilities and give them attention. It's like a conflict of interest.
It really is, Tom. And the further up the food chain you get to the higher paid help, the more it becomes important that they spend a fair amount of their time freeing themselves from the operational responsibilities and focusing on innovation. There's a wonderful nonprofit in Japan working very hard to help Japanese companies to innovate. It doesn't come easily to most of the Japanese transnationals. And a guy named Nobuo Kono, who is one of the founders of the Japan Innovation Network, if you can imagine this, he sits in the board meetings with boards of directors and CEOs in these extremely formal Japanese companies. He looks CEOs in the eye and says, if you're spending all your time on operational resources, on operational issues, you're only doing half your job. You should be spending half your time on operational issues and half your time on innovation. If you're spending all of your time on operational issues, you're only doing half your job, you should only have half benefits and half pay. This is a guy who says this in front of Japanese boards of directors. Can you imagine?
Wow.
I just love the sentiment, but it applies.
Right.
It's valid.
Right. So let me ask you, Dave, being out there, out and about, and helping these big companies, helping them be light-footed, helping them think beyond the quarterly numbers, and there's massive pressures to hit their numbers. What are 2 or 3 of the biggest obstacles that you see, and do you see them sort of time and time again?
Of course we do. Of course we do. I don't care what country you're in, what vertical industry you're in, what the makeup of the leadership is. Number one reason, of course, is governance. And as I mentioned earlier, governance is there for a reason. Big companies can't tread afoul of regulations. They need to be careful and slow and methodical in the way they go about things. But they need to understand selectively when to lift governance. They need to understand when to lift those onerous purchasing regulations and those onerous decision processes that take you 8 weeks or 12 weeks to bring in a consultant to do a couple hours of consulting on data analytics. They need to know in certain targeted times with high performing teams when to lift governance to let those teams race ahead. So the single issue is not lifting governance across the board for all employees. That would be chaos. A company couldn't operate.
Right.
It's that they do not have the ability to lift governance ever, and that's really to their detriment. The second thing I would list, in addition to selective lifting of governance, is fear of failure. Look, in general, companies hire people. If you're in a huge company, you generally hire people who have a mind around operational excellence and getting a well-defined job done well.
Right, efficiency,
Exactly.
process, workflow.
Exactly. And there's a sentiment that is common in the U.S. and even more common in many of the big Asian companies, which is a fear of failure. That a failure is a black cloud hanging over your head for the rest of your career. It's terrible. It's a huge piece of the corporate immune system or the corporate antibodies preventing innovation. And it is incumbent upon leadership in these big companies to come up with almost like a taxonomy of failure. There are some failures that are inexcusable. Careless errors, bad process, that's never excusable. But trying a venture, an early stage venture that ultimately doesn't pan out because of something unexpected in a direction the market took or a technology not working out, that's what I would call an appropriate failure. That's something that should actually be celebrated rather than being a black mark over somebody's head for the rest of his or her career in a big company. As a quick example, I would name Black & Decker, not known for amazing innovation, known for just fantastic first-rate tools from their product lines like DeWalt and so on. They put together a combination of lifting governance and completely unexpected entrepreneurial hires, and they are now racing ahead with multiple new ventures adjacent to what they're currently doing as a result of dealing with exactly the problems I just mentioned, combating this problem of governance and lifting it locally for certain empowered teams,
Right.
combined with a general statement accepting appropriate failure.
Right. Just as a quick interjection, but it reminds me of really what was almost prescient, and I think far ahead of what was common practice then, when Steve Jobs broke out the Mac team into another building, kept everybody away, and just went and did their own stuff without any of the structure and mechanisms that is required within a large company. The other thing I thought about when you talked about the fear of failure, the common denominator for success is resiliency, is persistence, is stubbornness. Fall down 7 times, get up 8, or whatever. Failure is always present.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the question is, have you made an appropriate failure? Do you stop the funding for a program that isn't working out just as early as possible by applying the minimum necessary resources to the maximum possible risk areas, stop it and move your team onto something new? Or do you allow it to become sort of a black mark or an anchor?
Right.
That's really the distinction.
Overcoming inertia, overcoming culture can feel overwhelming. And what advice might you offer, insight might you offer to companies and to the individuals working in there that can help them break this inertia?
Company inertia often feels overwhelming. And do you know why that is, Tom? Because company inertia is overwhelming. That's why.
Great. Yeah, that's very funny.
Yeah. Look, so as a result,
that's great.
What I say to your listeners is accept the fact that the inertia, the momentum of a massive organization, a massive freightliner moving forward, it is overwhelming. And for that reason, I advise your listeners to reject this notion of sort of wholesale innovation transformation, right? This whole notion of deductive or tops-down approaches, it sounds really groovy. Like if you're a big company executive, Tom, and I say to you, okay, I've talked to 20 other CEOs in similar industries to yours. I've created a very clear set of best practices about innovation. From the tops down, we're going to customize them to your organization, Tom, and we're going to and we're going to push them down, right? There's hiring process, and there's company structure, and there's physical space, and so on. It sounds good. The fact is, if you look at these programs honestly and unsentimentally, they just don't work. These sort of tops-down approaches to innovation are just so rarely successful. What tends to work is what I would call inductive, bottoms-up approaches to innovation, where a big organization creates a portfolio of small teams chasing after small opportunities. As I mentioned earlier, if things don't pan out, you stop the program and you move them on to some new opportunity. It is by opening your door to a little bit of chaos and allowing and empowering bottoms-up teams to thrive startup style and create new ventures and new lines of business.
Right.
That's really how you can make little adjustments in the huge tanker ship that is a typical Global 1000. So for example, Standard Bank, the biggest lender by assets in sub-Saharan Africa, the folks I worked with over the summer so carefully, they are not attempting to do wholesale corporate transformation to their organization. They're innovating by creating a number of small ventures and fertilizing and watering each of those. And taking a page from the best practices of VCs, they are, they're creating a portfolio of new ventures, knowing that if they're high enough risk, some will not move forward and others will really thrive. Yeah.
Top down is probably the way the majority of large organizations pursue innovation. They try to make a mandate, a cultural shift. We're now going to be an innovative company. It's almost counterintuitive, I would think, to do it in a bottoms-up way, but it makes so much sense when you explain it, because that's how it happens out in the world.
Listen, it's counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to me, Tom. I have to admit that my natural inclination is to go with a deductive approach. My natural inclination is to go for a wholesale transformation approach where we say, let's look at the winners in this space, let's extract lessons learned, and from the top, straight from the CEO, let's push that down into everything from hiring process to HR policy. I cannot argue with my 30 years of experience in this space, which has shown me over and over that such innovation transformation programs do not work. They
How
simply do not
difficult
work.
is it, Dave, to get a company to align with your experience on that?
The best answer I can give you is, you need to have a certain humility about your own ability to persuade people of the correctness of your particular vision, right? So look, if a leadership team is fundamentally and wholeheartedly bought in to a tops-down approach to innovation, we may not have a lot to say to them, okay? The audience that we get traction with, Tom, are the ones, the sorts of individuals where, let's imagine, for example, someone is, a CEO is looking around and logically enough says to themselves, look, Uber banged, Avis and Hertz over the head, and Airbnb smacked Hyatt and Hilton. Gee, I'm in banking. I'm next. Some data analytics finance startup out of Menlo Park is coming for me next. So it's the people that are acutely aware of the sort of classic Clayton Christensen style environment of disruption that we face in the business world today. People that are already attuned to that and that are looking for a path forward and an execution path forward for new ventures, or for investing in external startups to advance their innovation initiatives. Those are the folks where we normally see traction and where we normally see a meeting of the minds.
It's interesting. I just think back on some large companies I've been in, and they've been successful almost in spite of themselves. And as proof of the difficulty, these products that became successful were done clandestinely.
Yes.
Because they didn't want to get shut down. So the employees had the initiative and the wherewithal to do them and kind of keep them under wraps until such point that they could sort of show they were getting some traction. And even then, these offerings were viewed sort of askance. They kind of had to really fight to break through to survive and flourish.
Absolutely. You mentioned Steve Jobs and creating a skunkworks a while back. Skunkworks have been around for a long time. Corporate skunkworks that are free of corporate governance and can race ahead. What is new is our contention that a skunkworks can effectively be institutionalized and embraced by any company anywhere. They used to be the exception. And now we believe that creating, building, and launching new ventures from within is something that should be in the corporate DNA of any Global 1000 company.
Right. Which brings us to Mach 49.
The big idea will make sense to your listeners. Mach is the speed of sound, and Mach 49, if a spacecraft moves at Mach 49 times the speed of sound, it breaks free from the Earth's gravitational well and into outer space.
What is the Mach 49 advice for executing change?
Sure. Mach 49 says this to Global 1000 companies. Take a page, odd as it might sound, from the venture capital and startup playbook. Get good at incubating startups inside your company, creating, building, and launching new lines of business using salaried employees, maybe with a few additional people added to the team if you need them. Similarly, take a page from the VC playbook. Get good at building incubators inside your organization, and get good at investing in external startups that will help advance your strategic initiatives.
There are lots of different perspectives on innovation. In fact, I feel it's an overused word nowadays. How can folks sort of cut through the noise and get right to the salient parts of what's relevant for innovation?
What I've seen for the winners in innovation is that they never really adhere to a single perspective, and rather they take multiple perspectives on innovation and they grab different methods and tools to come up with a custom mix that's right for them. So what I recommend to your listeners, Tom, is this. Get familiar, at least to the level of a couple of Wikipedia entries, with the big four perspectives. And these overlap a bit, they're not exclusive. The big four perspectives on innovation. First, design thinking. Design thinking is such a fad these days that that people conflate the idea of innovation in general with the idea of design thinking, and they shouldn't be confused. Innovation is creation resulting from study and experimentation that leads to a measurable societal or economic benefit. Now, design thinking is just one of 4 typical ways to innovate. Design thinking says, hey, let's take a page from the designer's playbook. Let's look at architecture, graphic design, advertising, and so on. And let's use those methods of inspiration from user experience, synthesis, and iterative prototyping used by designers, and let's reapply those in financial services or to a government agency. Okay, so that's design thinking. Second, I recommend that your listeners get familiar with lean and agile methods, reading up works by people like Eric Ries and Bob Dorff and Steve Blank. Get familiar with the notion of a minimum viable product and a sprint, and ask yourself exactly what does that mean to my business, and how might I apply not necessarily literally agile development, which was built originally for software, but agile thinking, the thinking and the philosophy behind agile development. How might I apply that? What place does it have?
Might that thinking, in your experience, also apply to service companies, to product companies, to basically companies outside of software?
Absolutely. Sprints, I challenge every one of my customers to structure their programs and to think in terms of sprints, right? We build operating plans in which what we do is identify risk areas across multiple different dimensions, work out the mitigation for those risks. And these might be technical risks, business risks, customer acceptance risks, risks with the mothership, because we're talking about a new venture inside a big organization. We work out the risk areas, we work out experiments to mitigate those risks, we knit those together into an operating plan, and what have you got? What you've got is a set of sprints, one after another, where you are essentially turning your little organization, your little new venture, into a risk mitigation machine, knocking down this technical risk and this business risk and this user acceptance risk with simple low fidelity experiments. That's such a good countermeasure against the normal corporate approach to commit some massive monolithic piece of funding to some new venture. Third, I do recommend all of your listeners get familiar with open innovation, pioneered by Henry Chesborough from UC Berkeley. The idea of very porous boundaries, permeable boundaries to your organization, where you never have not invented here. And what you do is, in a very even-handed way, look around the whole world for best-in-class product, service, other providers to understand whether you should be insourcing or outsourcing your new venture development.
Right, or some hybrid thereof.
Always, almost always a hybrid. And then finally, you've got a method, you've got a perspective on innovation that like incorporates many of those, and that's disruptive innovation from the late, great Clayton Christensen, who died recently, an amazing business thinker. And just to remind everybody, disruptive innovation is not like Procter & Gamble, grabbing a couple of percentage points of margin from Kimberly-Clark by investing hundreds of millions in promotions and marketing. Disruptive innovation is a small entity often working in an unrelated field, flipping a big business on its head and completely changing the socioeconomics of a particular type of business. Think of Musk with his electric cars. Think of Uber, these types of
things. Yeah, right. It's not a dot release. It's like something coming out of left field that.
Exactly right. Exactly right. SpaceX, who we mentioned earlier, another good example of disruptive innovation, just completely coming out of left field. So my recommendation to your listeners is get familiar with those methods and say to yourself, all right, how can I grab appropriately methods and tools and approaches from each of these to come up with a really, really good set of tools that are appropriate for my organization, whatever the industry is, whatever the organization is. That's a much more sophisticated approach than just, for example, taking classes from the D.school and attempting to bang every possible problem with the solution of design thinking. Design thinking has been very, very good for me after decades at IDEO, but I can't present it as an answer to every possible innovation. Yes.
Dave, you'd mentioned sort of how to get footholds in each of these areas.
No better resource than the D.school. They've got some wonderful online resources to give people a crash course in design thinking. Okay. Books by Eric Ries, R-I-E-S, and online materials from Steve Blank, including his blog and his business model Canvas, will give you a wonderful introduction to agile and lean methods. Hank Chesborough at Berkeley wrote some seminal papers on open innovation, and of course, reading, or watching a YouTube lecture from Clayton Christensen on disruptive innovation will help there. So
Wonderful, wonderful.
I'm not suggesting that people get, graduate degrees in these, in the intellectual studies of these pursuits. I'm suggesting you jump in just to get a little bit conversant with them, so you can start to answer the question of what's valuable and what's in it for me.
It's really interesting that you outline those 4 areas because they're all atypically associated with large companies. I mean, design thinking, thinking lean and agile, open innovation. I mean, a lot of those were sort of almost anathema to how companies used to go about their business, at least back in the 80s and probably the 90s. So it's interesting. It's a real revolution.
It is, but I will tell you, the word revolution involves some amount of discomfort. And let me tell you this, Mach 49, as appropriate, employs methods from each of these schools of thought around innovation, right? We structure sprints, we do early stage open-ended research straight out of the design thinking playbook. And here's the thing, yes, it may be revolutionary, but it's not esoteric, it's not weird, and it is absolutely a learnable skill as opposed to some sort of innate talent. At Mach 49, we work in every industry vertical with organizations all over the world, and we have never worked with any type of people in any type of organization who couldn't readily learn the methods and tools of what we like to call disrupting outside in and disrupting inside out.
I love it. It's good to hear. I thank you very much for your time, Dave. It's always so interesting to talk with you. Best of success going forward with your work and helping clients, and I know you'll continue to do great things.
Thank you, Tom. It's been a pleasure.